Yo, and welcome back to the Banter Boys podcast. My name is Sanji. With me is Ross. How you doing, boy?
I'm very good, Sanji. Nice to be here.
Thank you so much for reaching out, being the hero that we all need at the last hour. I truly appreciate you approaching us for the opportunity to rep your club. So I won't spoil it. I'll let you kick things off with the fan introduction. Tell us your name, your Twitter handle, which club you're representing this evening, where you're from, and a little bit about what you do.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Sanjit. So my name's Ross Taylor. My Twitter handle is RossTaylor79, which gives away a little bit about my age. I'm a 43-year-old Forest fan who probably shouldn't be walking the streets wearing a football shirt anymore, but I still do. So my club allegiance is Nottingham Forest. I was born in 1979, which was a significant year for the club with European victories. And I don't sound like I'm from Nottingham for a couple of reasons. One, I was born in Swindon originally and actually chose to study in Nottingham, which was largely born around my desire to see Forest. But I also have a little bit of a twang because I've moved to the US in 2014. So I'm based in Austin, Texas. And what I do is I'm a husband and a dad of two little people who happens to also work in semiconductor sales.
Lovely. I hope you don't call it soccer every day, right?
I try not to. I kind of interchange a little bit. Sometimes it depends on the audience. I also have two American children, so sometimes you just have to know your audience. But yeah, it's football to me.
Love it. All right. So fans, welcome to another Inside Trax series episode. Basically, the series we've been interviewing each of the 20 clubs, fans basically repping their clubs, and fans that also play fan tracks. And this one's a bit special because I believe we're converting Ross from the FPL platform to Fantrax, and he expressed a lot of interest given his history, and we'll get into that later. But we're gonna cover everything Nottingham Forest today, and the template for these episodes have been we have a bit of a general discussion. We talk about the impacts of new manager / ownership, club's previous season performance versus new season's expectations, old system versus new system, basically the impact of new transfers, and especially like club like Nottingham Forest, where you guys seem to never stop buying people, especially last season. We'll also touch on expected formation, starting 11, the impact of AFCON as well, and Asian Cup. And then obviously we're going to jump into the fan track side of things. So we're going to pick Ross's brain on who his first pick might be, his next 3 picks, at least one hidden gem. And then we'll chat a little bit about how I guess we can teach him about trading and FA waiver advice, or maybe stuff that he has learned in his previous experiences playing similar formats of the game, but maybe not in the EPL. And then, we'll just see how the chat goes. So let's get started. All right. So in terms of new manager ownership, you guys didn't really have a change last season, unless there's something that happened in the background that the average football fan isn't aware of.
No, absolutely. We continue with Steve Cooper, and long may that continue. So for those unknown to Forest's history, we were 23 years outside of the Premier League, but for some heroics of Steve Cooper taking us from the lower level of Championship right the way through the playoffs, we wouldn't be a Premier League club right now. Last season, I think, there was a couple of moments during the season where the club could have easily parted with Cooper, just largely because of trying to get players integrated at the level. And as you mentioned, Sanjay, in terms of we had to recruit a lot of players last season. It was a necessity. Whether Forest were in the Championship or in the Premier League, there was a high degree of turnover. And I think this season is very much around refining in terms of getting some extra quality. So you won't be seeing, 30 signings or whatever this window, but it might be 3 or 4 who actually fit into the first team, and really might be ones to keep an eye on as this window closes over the coming month. So the situation with Cooper is an interesting one. I could see it going one of 2 ways. If Forest don't get a hot start and they struggle with some really tough away fixtures, then, Cooper could be exposed and the club may have to make a decision against him. I really hope that doesn't happen. On the other side of the coin is if other clubs don't get a good start, then, Cooper's going to be a real contender to be poached. So it could be a coin toss as to which way it goes. Probably for the average Forest fan, somewhere in the middle is just about right, that Cooper keeps us going, keeps us ticking, keeps us improving, but just beneath the radar of desire of others.
Yeah, and I mean, you're talking about in terms of good starts and stuff. Like your fixtures are actually one of the hardest sets, like harder sets, I would say, compared to other clubs. And listen, in the Premier League, there are definitely no easy games, but the way your season starts is Arsenal away, Sheffield United at home, Manchester United away, Chelsea away, Burnley at home, and then Manchester City away.
Yeah, it's quite the melting pot in there for sure. And I think there's a bit of a good and bad on that. So one is because let's call them free hits for want of a better term.
Yeah.
Some of those away fixtures really are just like if you can pick something up, then great. And at the back end of last season, away from home, Forest seemed to have a formula that at least kind of made them less vulnerable. And, it's not inconceivable we could catch a couple of those quote unquote bigger teams cold in the early weeks because with the transfer window being open, teams bedding in, I think there's going to be a few irregular results. So I'm really hopeful that maybe, Forest could scratch a draw at Arsenal or Man United in the first few weeks. Conversely, though, with the first two home games being Sheffield United and Burnley, and also Forest having such a great home record last season, should they not get the hot start at home, then I'm fearful that it could create some questions, especially if it's compounded by some tough away fixtures. So, to my previous point about Cooper, it's not inconceivable that if we have a rough start, that the international window then starts to raise questions around management change. Or on the flip side, if we were to catch a few of those bigger teams cold, we could maybe be ahead of where we would expect to be, and also, making sure that we've bedded in with some solid home victories against those teams that, you have to really target. That's not to be disrespectful to them, but Sheffield United and Burnley, you have to target at home as being a place where you get points.
Yeah, I would say definitely last season, your home form was what kind of saved you. I want to
Yeah.
say, it was honestly, I think away games like in my head, I pretty much just wrote it off, right? At home, I wonder if there was like a home table. It wouldn't surprise me if you guys were like had like top four, top six sort of home table form. Like you guys just have a fortress out there. But I mean, looking at last season as well, it kind of I wouldn't say came down to the wire, but it surprised me a little bit that you guys managed to, I guess, confirm safety with a game or two to spare. Am I correct?
Yeah, yeah. So I mean, I think it was a strange kind of 5 or 6 games at the end of the season where it really felt like certain key games were must win from about 6 games out. Southampton at home, we beat them 4-3. Brighton at home, 1-3-1. And we really got to that point where, the Arsenal at home game, which was the penultimate game, by winning, it kept us in the division, and it meant that there was very much a party atmosphere on the last day at Crystal Palace. So, I had no teeth. I was like chewing my teeth for pretty much every game last season. It was like watching a cup final, and that last 5 or 6 games, you just couldn't afford to lose. And this season it would be really nice if we were in a space where I don't know 2, 3 games out, we know that we're safe. And I'm kind of optimistic there because Forest conceded 21 points from winning positions last season. And I get that they were probably lucky in a couple of games too. But if you can convert, I don't know, 8, 9, 10 of those points, then suddenly you're in the sort of 11th place, kind of above Palace type conversation. And your season has a very different trajectory. So, that's the hopeful kind of aspiration, I think. But to get there, absolutely, the City Ground has to remain a fortress. And, what an atmosphere for anyone who watched last season. One of the hardest parts of being away and living in the US is not being able to feel that goosebump moment, when Mulligan tires played out at the City Ground. There really isn't a better atmosphere in the Premier League.
You need to just move back to the UK, Ross. That's
Yeah, competing interests there, but certainly from a football perspective, I'd certainly like to make more of a trip. And I had the good fortune to go to Old Trafford last season, so I'm not completely out of watching the Forest games, but it's been pretty hard, obviously, being a distant traveller and getting access to tickets with such a strong fan base.
definitely. I mean. to touch on the previous season's performance as well before we move on to like transfers and stuff like that. It felt like your season was a tale of two halves, really, and that the World Cup break came like a blessing. I feel like it gave time to Steve Cooper to figure out a more set starting 11 as well. Because I think like your form was completely like contrasting.
Yeah, absolutely. Last season was very different, but for a lot of reasons, it was kind of like two mini seasons for many. I think it only came at a good time. Now, if you think about the fact that they had to sign 30 odd players or less than in that first window, but not being funny, but 4 or 5 of those games, these guys probably don't even know each other's names, yet alone like what they were really going to do in the system setup and stuff like that. So I really have to commend the club for, they gave Steve Cooper an extended contract off the back of a 4-0 defeat at Leicester. They really recognised that there was work to do that was way outside of his influence. And, he did as good a job as he could to integrate those players. And now I think we're going to see the fruits bearing a little bit more in terms of at least we're talking about, a minor turnover relative to last season. So a lot of that first 6 to 8 weeks last season was about familiarity. And then once the World Cup came back, we kind of had a little bit of a burst. And, from there, once you kind of get a structure and a bit of confidence and, working through key players that we'll obviously talk about, I think we were in a far stronger position. But this season will be interesting. Without that World Cup, I know that we'll talk about AFCON and other kind of interruptions, but it's going to be a different challenge, and I think we're going to really draw upon the squad again because injuries were a big problem for us last season.
So do you expect another struggle, or do you think you can manage maybe like that? Like I would say top of the second half of the Prem table, right? It'll make like maybe 10th to 14th versus 14th to 16th or something like that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that bottom third there's really not a lot in it. And if you think about last season, how condensed it was. Now, we'll see this season. I don't want to be dismissive of any of the teams that got promoted, but if there are 2 or 3 teams that seem to just really drop off early, then it does change the conversation. And we kind of rattled in with sort of 37 or so points last season. I think improvement there if we could get 4 or 5 more and then see where the league position gets us. That would be a fair and reasonable target. I think maybe the club had slightly higher aspirations because there's been some big investment. So, a top half finish is probably a fair and reasonable goal. But again, depending on some of the transfers, if we could close out on some of the names I'm sure we'll talk about, then there may be expectations for more. But really targeting the behavioural and the kind of result patterns of a Brentford and a Fulham from last season, I think really is the target that you have to look at and try and keep yourself that little bit further apart from the real bun fight at the bottom.
Do you read a lot into your preseason form, because it's not looked great this season?
Well, I'm trying not to. I'm taking the optimistic view, which is it's all about getting legs into the body, in terms of just conditioning the players. And also, if you think about the results we've had, so as you say, mixed bag. We've popped up with the odd win, draw, and also some heavy defeats. Today we drew 0-0 away at Frankfurt, which I think was a more representative team and also result. So similarly, if we could get a 0-0 draw at Arsenal the first game of the season, it wouldn't be the end of the world. So I'm not trying to draw too much from it, but there was also some key absences for probably about half of our starting 11 in those early weeks, which is obviously a concern in terms of just readiness. And, so I'm trying not to look too much into it, just the fact that, hopefully we're now at a place where, we're closer to a starting 11 and as close to readiness as we can be for Arsenal, because obviously it's a huge test to start the season.
Yeah, for sure. All right, let's talk about some transfers. So I'm going to go as far back as last summer. I'm just going to pick a few names that I thought were kind of relevant throughout the season, and maybe you can kind of quickly touch on them and give us an update on whether or not they'll be a relevant asset that we can consider for the next season. So first one that comes up is Taiwo Awoniyi. I feel like he had some very vital goal contributions towards the back end of last season. Do you think he's going to be a relevant prospect for next season?
Yeah, absolutely. And, he had a real hot run of form towards the back end of the season. I think I'm right in saying he got 4 and 5 towards the end. He's a good asset in terms of just being a target as an outlet ball for the team. And works hard, and pops up with the odd goal here and there. And I think he was improving for sure. He was a little bit disruptive with injury last season, and as with a few of these Forest players, I'm a bit nervous about injury records. But I think Taiwo is a good potential asset if he is able to get through 30 or 35 games, then I think our managers here are going to get some good rewards because he's going to be key to at least connecting the attacking play, if not being the person that puts it in the back of the net.
Okay, Dean Henderson came in from Manchester United on loan. I'm not sure if you guys signed him permanently or not, but he got injured as well. And we saw Keylor Navas, who we'll talk a bit about later. What are your thoughts about Dean Henderson, and would you like to see him be the nailed asset for next season?
Yeah, so it's an interesting one. So I think Dean Henderson's attitude in around the club for a lone player was pretty incredible, and I think the fans really warmed to him just in terms of his passion, and he's clearly a high class goalkeeper. He's still a Manchester United player. There are a lot of suggestions that Forest are still in for him, but there's also some suggestions that the injury that kept him out last season may be a little bit more troublesome than they thought. So as a result, we've also been linked with Matt Turner, the US goalkeeper who's at Arsenal. So goalkeeper change is imminent, I think, at Forest. We may go into that first game of the season, even with youngster George Shelvey or Ethan Horvath. But I think from a kind of fan Trax perspective, it's probably a operate with caution position at this point in time, because I think there's some change there. But Matt Turner, I think, is the most likely target that they'll close, because the Henderson situation seems to have been rather protracted, and I don't really understand it, because there's some suggestions that even Dean Henderson's moved house not far from Nottingham. So it feels like it's something that's really, really imminent, but the injury history is probably something of concern too.
Yeah, that's a great point. Okay, defender coming in from Mainz, Musa Niakate. He started the season, looked fairly solid at the back. He was scoring some good Fantrax points as well. But then he got, again, we talk about injuries to Forest players. Is he another player that is fit for the season? Is there a chance that he's playing this season?
I mean, I think there's a high chance he'll play. It's just a question of when. I'm not sure he featured today. I think he's still out at the moment. He's an interesting asset because he's got a long throw that kind of gets him further up the field, and the team use it as a bit of a weapon. He's also got a bit of pace, which some of our other defenders don't. So it really creates the option where Forest can play four at the back when Niakate is playing, and you pair him up with Felipe. I think if Forest have had Niakate and Felipe for 30 games last season, then they would have been a top half side. They just offer so much more in terms of just being able to play a little higher up the pitch. So I really hope Niakate is back. But yeah, his injury record hasn't been great. So, and Forest are a little bit cagey when it comes to injuries. They oftentimes don't disclose much, and that means that either means they come back 2 weeks before you expect them, or they suddenly don't come back for 2 months. So, and with the previous history we've had with some of the injuries, it's definitely something to be a bit cautious of. But he's a good asset. I think he's going to be a strong player for Forest, and if he stays fit, then Forest will be fine.
All right. So next one on the list is Nico Williams. He came in from Liverpool. I guess coming in from any top 4, top 6 sort of European club, there's a lot of expectation with their output. But even though I would say he is maybe decent going forward, I wasn't too sure about his defensive output. Do you think there's any chance that he could have an impact next season?
Yeah, I think so, just largely because of his versatility. He can play on the right or the left side. I think one of the limitations there, as you mentioned, is he is probably better equipped within either a back 3 or a back 5, where he's the wing back, versus being in the back 4. I think when we saw a back 4 with Nico, he was probably a little bit more exposed. And with so many teams really attacking with pace down the wings and trickery, I'm not so sure I'd want to play right back either. So, if we're in a 3 or a 5, then I think Williams can be, a solid kind of late round or kind of free agency pickup, because there's a role there, and I also think he can deliver some quality in that final third. And I'm sure we'll talk about Brennan Johnson, but should he move on for any reason, then Nico's versatility may see him play further up the pitch in the absence of a kind of out and out right winger.
Okay, so let's talk about Oral Mangala. I feel like the average football fan, let alone the Fantrax manager, wouldn't know too much about him. What can you tell us?
So Oral Mangala is a nice, tidy ball playing midfielder. He came in from, he's Belgian international, came in from Europe. And, I think when he first started out, we were all pretty excited about him. And then he kind of phased in and out again with some injury. Tidy on the ball. I think we're trying to retain possession a little bit more, and I think Mangala could have a big season in that space. Remo Freuler was kind of the default starter at the beginning, but as Forest's season improved at the back end, he kind of got phased out, and I think Mangala had a more prominent play. So, it's going to be more of a kind of interception and kind of ball-moving midfield player versus a kind of dynamic number 8, but certainly tidy for our system.
So, next player on the list, Emmanuel Dennis, came in from Watford. I feel like there was a bit of expectation with him, given the impact that he had with Watford when they were last in the Premier League. But it never quite worked out for him. I mean, he scored a goal here or there, but it just fizzled out. What went wrong?
Yeah, I mean, he had a couple of good moments. I remember Aston Villa at home last season. He popped up with a tidy finish, and away at Leeds as well. I think he's just one of those players that maybe struggled to just settle and also sort of find his function in the team. I know that he's been connected as a potential departure to Leeds as well. So, while he's very much sort of active within the club media at the moment, it wouldn't surprise me either if he moved on. So maybe he's another one that's kind of handled with care. But yeah, he certainly didn't have that impact that he did at Watford. I remember he had that kind of standout season. And, he's playing on the left-hand side, maybe not too conducive to a system where we kind of have to press as one team. And also maybe you just kind of got found out a little bit within the Premier League in terms of, what his tricks were and all that sort of stuff. So I don't think he's long for Forest, actually, but we'll see.
All right. Next, Chiku Kuyate. I thought he did well. His flexibility as a football player allowed him to play multiple positions in the team. Is there a chance that he could have a nailed spot for next season?
Yeah, I think nailed is probably a little generous. I think he's in his early 30s. He was one of those players I think looked really strong up to the World Cup and then got an injury that kept him out for a while. So that was kind of frustrating because the good thing about Kuyate is, he can play in that sort of deep-seated midfield position, but then also sort of drop into a 5 if you are playing a back 4. He's got that physical presence both in the air and on the ground. And I was really impressed considering he was a free transfer that we picked up last season and clearly had good experience and was at the level. So he would have been a strong asset if he'd been able to stay fit. But I suspect that could be, again, another one who's a bit of a risk in that space. And, and I'm sure we'll talk about potential transfers in and out, but there's also been some suggestion that maybe some of the Saudi teams are circling there. And obviously that's a kind of potentially lucrative consideration for the player. So if he can stay fit and if he stays at Forest, then I think he's got room to have a role. But his last few games, I remember Brentford away, I think he had a couple of errors that kind of pretty forgettable. So, he probably needs to just make sure he's holding to the level and staying fit.
All right. Another name, Remo Freuler, that came in from Atalanta. He played a lot of minutes last season as well. Any updates on his situation?
Yeah, so I mean, he's in and around the club, and I think there's been also some suggestions that he could be transferred out. He's a really nice ball-playing midfield player, but I think that, I don't want to be disparaging, but the pace of the league in Serie A is probably more conducive versus the Premier League. So I think a couple of times I was watching him and kind of like, oh dear, it looks like he's kind of like treading water when tracking back. So he just doesn't have that same dynamism in midfield that I think you need in the Premier League. So, and also if you look at Forest's kind of improvement, even if the results weren't that great in the second half, but I think their general improvement was when Freuler wasn't there and when the likes of Ryan Yates were. So I think he's, early stage of the season could be in and around the squad. But also, again, it wouldn't surprise me if they decided to move him on because he's got the quality, but maybe it's just in a slightly different pace of league.
Okay. So another player that came in from a foreign league, Renan Lodi, from Atletico Madrid on loan. Has he gone back to Atletico Madrid?
No, so he was a nice player on loan, and he has actually moved on a permanent transfer to Marseille. So he's no longer a kind of Fantrax asset consideration. But for Forest, I think left back is an area of concern because a couple of reasons. We had major injury in relation to Omar Richards, who poor guy was out for a year with stress fracture, pins that had to get removed, and then more recently had a double hernia. So he's had just a
Wow.
really tough year. And for any Reading fans out there, I think he was a really strong player for them before moving to Bayern Munich. So it was just a real sad story that we didn't get any value out of Omar Richards, but he's in and around the scene, and obviously we'll hope that for his own career he can stay fit. But so left back I think is an area of concern for Forest to get some depth. We've been linked with Ishmael Jacobs of Monaco, who also might have some other offers, and we also have a cloud over us in relation to Harry Toffolo. Has some suggestions of some betting behaviours that may obviously create some risk to his availability. So I certainly don't want to certify him guilty, but the suggestions are that there might be a difficult time ahead there. So Harry Toffolo, unfortunately, might be someone to avoid.
Interesting, interesting. Next name, I know there's a lot of names that we're talking about, but it's just because of how you guys did your business last season. Willy Bully came in from Wolves. I thought he was a really good, dependable centre back at Wolves. Surprised that he made the move. But again, another player that I think whose season was affected by injury. He was in and out of the team. What do you think of him as being an option for next season?
Yeah, I think he's a good option. He's a good pro. I think again, part of Forest's upturn last season was almost stumbling on a formation which involved Warren and Bolly through a cup game, and also just moving to a four for some of the home games. And Bolly was kind of involved in that before Felipe came in. So I think he's got that pedigree in terms of just being at the level and just being a pretty no nonsense central defender. I'd anticipate he'll feature potentially in that first game. Just because the availability of some others, I mentioned Niakate and Felipe is out as well. So I think Bolly could have a role in a back three, most probably alongside Worrell and McKenna. So he could feature, but again he's kind of the other side of 30, and as a result, he's probably more of a 20 game a season player than any more.
Fair enough. Okay, I would say maybe second to last name in this transfer window from last summer that I want to talk about. Serge Aurier. I think, I mean, on personal level, he definitely had a very tough time with the loss of his brother, etc. He left Spurs, but then he kind of found a home in Nottingham Forest, and I think he reminded fantasy managers of his potential, especially going forward. Is he potentially your starting, I want to say, maybe right wing back for next season?
I suspect so. I think again he's another one who goes in and out of injury a little bit, but he's got that pedigree, and I think his time at Spurs was probably more difficult, but he was way more consistent for Forest last season, and for a free signing, he was a great asset, and as a result of staying up, he activated his retention for next season. So he'll probably be competing alongside with Nico Williams on that right side, and most likely as a wing back. I think Aurier has a little bit more versatility. He could play right side of a three, or as a more traditional right back. So, from that perspective, he's a good asset. He's always susceptible to the odd yellow card, and the odd ricket here and there. But I was really impressed with him last season. He was a real pleasant surprise. I know maybe some Spurs fans were surprised in what they saw, but he's definitely a good pro to have around the club.
Definitely. Okay, now let's talk about your best asset from that summer window. Coming in from Wolves, Morgan Gibbs-White. Oh, what a player. I mean, we saw his output for Sheffield United, right? I guess not last season, the season before. But yeah, I think if the tuned in fantasy managers were aware of how how good of a player he was, they would have moved quickly on an asset like him, because I think he was a bit of a sleeper last season after he joined Nottingham Forest. And maybe, again, the average fan would have been confused by his price tag. But yeah, can you tell us a little bit about Morgan Gibbs-White?
Yeah, absolutely. I think we could dedicate a whole show to Morgan Gibbs-White. So I'm sure fantasy managers kind of cashed in on him last year because as you say, he was probably a bit of a sleeper who I think, if I'm understanding right, was kind of a very high ranked player, top 20 based upon the rankings for this year's draft. Probably in the sort of first, second round turn. And yeah, he came in from Wolves. He was clearly had some previous with with Steve Cooper, and he was the guy to go get, and he is central to the team. And for good and for bad, if you stop Gibbs-White, you probably stop Forest. But he's tricky. He works hard. Wins the ball high up the pitch. I can't remember a player who operates at 90% speed for like 90% of the game. The guy is just a machine. And then he has that burst of pace to break with the ball when needed. So, he was a great player that came in, had a really strong season. I think I'm right in saying his goal contributions last year were better than Jack Grealish, and I think it's fair to say Grealish had a good season for City. And then in this summer, he's been part of this under-21s team that was successful and central to it. So I think Gibbs-White has got a really high ceiling. I'd be surprised if he isn't in and around the senior international squad this season. Obviously there's a lot of expectation from a kind of fantasy perspective because he's no longer a sleeper. He's going to be kind of a premium asset, but as I say, he's on all the set pieces. Everything good that goes through Forest is pretty much through Gibbs-White, and he plays a lot of minutes. So I think he's a strong, robust asset in this sort of sort of Jared Bowen type ilk in terms of what you'd expect as output.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, we love assets that have all set pieces, right? And one of the set pieces that he kind of took over towards the back end of last season were penalties. Is he still nailed on pens?
I mean, I think he's the go-to. He goes. I wouldn't, for all of his attributes, I wouldn't say penalties are his strongest. I think there's been some predictability there, and also, I think he missed one against Forest in the playoff semi-final before he was a Forest player. So, there's a little bit of a bizarre history there. But I think he's probably he's on them at this point in time. But again, handle with care a little bit. But you have to assume that he'll convert plenty. But I also think some of these goalkeepers these days are watching so many videos, and actually scoring a penalty is not as hard. It's a lot harder than it used to be. So again, you have to be a little cautious there. But I would assume he would be on pens because he took those off Brennan Johnson last season and has done a job thus far.
Okay, so now let's look at the January window from last season. A player that had a good impact in your last few games. I think he went on a little bit of a scoring streak. Danilo coming in from Palmeiras.
Yeah, I really like Danilo. I think the expectation when he came in was kind of more of a holding midfield player, and we brought in a few Brazilians, which I think kind of helped integrate. We mentioned Lodi as well and Felipe. So I think this season hopefully will be a little bit more settled, and he's pretty dynamic. I think he's that kind of sort of more classic box to box kind of number 8, and I think he's even had spells kind of alongside Gibbs-White behind a main striker. So he's going to be a bit more of a known quantity probably this season versus someone who you'd have just picked up, free agency last year. But I think, if you can get him in late rounds, then he's going to be a really decent asset to have, because I think his game time is going to be good. His contribution is going to be good across all the key metrics. And, he's young. I look at him as kind of, it's harsh to, put a harsh comparison, but, the attributes of someone like Jude Bellingham, I see a lot of that in Danilo, maybe with sort of more of a left-footed style. And I do think he's one of those sorts of players, maybe like Brennan, who we'll talk about, and maybe even Gibbs-White downstream, where, the ceiling is so high that, it's going to be hard to keep hold of that type of player. So I think he's going to have a good season. I really like Danilo, really do.
Yeah, I think he was involved in, I would say, one of your goals of the season. I think it was a cross in from along the floor. Might have been from Brennan. And then Morgan Gibbs White had this classy heel flick into
Yeah.
Danilo's path, and Danilo just hit it into the back of the net. Yeah, yeah.
Yes, it was late
Definitely
against
well
Brighton.
to clear.
If I'm right,
Yeah.
it was late against Brighton, and Danilo popped up. He popped up with a goal away at Brentford last season as well, which was kind of
Mm.
classy. So I think he could be one of those players that that Gibbs White looks for as we attack. And again, with those away fixtures that we mentioned being a little ugly, counter attack play might be prominent. So although on paper it might not look like a smart play to put Danilo away at Manchester United, it also wouldn't surprise me if he just popped up with one, with a marauding run.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, next player I want to touch on, Gustavo Scarpa. I want to say Twitter was going wild. It's like, oh, this guy is a skateboarder. He seems like, a really cool guy to come play for the club. But he didn't really get a lot of opportunity last season.
Yeah, it was a strange one. I think we all kind of were intrigued because his contribution in the Brazilian league was really high. I think his goal contributions were expected to be good. I think for him, if Gibbs White were to be absent for any reason, then maybe he would have more of a role. I think he's kind of probably that sort of left side, sort of, number 10, option. And I think, again, he was probably one of those players I think was pivotal to integrating Danilo. So I don't know whether the club kind of had a macro plan that, you get one, you can get the other. And maybe he's sort of drifted in and out a little bit with injury. But it would be nice to see him in the fold. I don't think he's going to be up there in the early weeks. He doesn't seem to have been sort of front and centre at this point in time. But yeah, he certainly seems to be a character. He's got skateboard videos, seems to love the city. Not necessarily a sort of archetypal footballer. But he's got a sweet left foot. It's just we want to see it a little bit more, and hopefully he'll get some opportunities for good reasons.
Okay. So a striker that you guys brought in on loan from Newcastle United, Chris Wood. I want to say he's a proven player in the Prem. For a few consecutive seasons, he was getting at least 10 goals, like in the double-digit range for Burnley. He struggled a bit, I want to say, maybe at Newcastle, and then came to Nottingham Forest, scored a very important goal against Man City, if I'm not mistaken, but then got injured, and we didn't see him again.
Yeah, exactly. And that loan move was one that kind of went permanent pretty quickly. So we've actually converted that option. So Wood is, probably one of our kind of key strikers at this point. If Awoniyi's injured and if there's doubts around Brennan Johnson, either for fitness or a potential transfer. So yeah, he's got that pedigree. I thought when Newcastle signed him, it was a pretty smart play because, they were basically limiting Burnley as well as enriching their own team. And he's obviously got that kind of record in terms of being a Premier League player. From what I saw last season, I think many fans are in the same boat. He just looked a little just ring rusty. His touch was a little bit off. Also, we weren't holding the ball. We weren't getting a lot of the ball. So, it was a difficult run. So I do think he's a sort of player that needs a run of games, and some good service. And as you mentioned, the Man City goal was goal of the season for the club. But I think you and I could have probably bundled that one in. No disrespect to Chris Wood. That was all about Gibbs White and Brennan Johnson. But
Definitely.
it's funny that the goal of the season was probably the easiest tap in, but it was a really good team goal.
Yeah, big result as well, right? It was a draw, from what I remember.
Correct.
So I would say maybe the last one I want to talk about from this window, because I don't know if talking about Shelby Navas or Andre Ayew makes sense. So I want to focus on Felipe right now. He came in halfway through the season and cemented his place. He was a ghost machine in the Fantrax format as well. Is he fit at the moment? Because I've not seen him in preseason.
No, there's been some suggestions his knee is a little bit questionable at this point in time, which is a concern because he's a really class act. Coming in from Atletico Madrid, he was a real dark arts merchant, and all of that sort of Simeone tactics he sort of brought to Forest, and I think we needed that sort of sense of resilience and just match day smarts, if you like. Very, very classy player. Disgustingly attractive man, unfairly attractive man. But again, he's another one I think he's just turned 34. If the knee is questionable, then it could be a concern. So
I know Forest have been linked with a couple of centre-backs in recent days that might suggest that Felipe's availability might be more than questionable. So again, to my previous point about them being somewhat guarded about injuries, he's one of those who could show up in 2 weeks or could equally be on the sidelines for 2 months and we wouldn't really know. So I'm a little nervous there because, as I mentioned, if we had a whole season with Niakate and Felipe, I think Forest would be, very, very safe.
Okay, so looking at the current window, two of the three ins, because I mean we've talked about Chris Wood already. One, Anthony Elanga coming in from Manchester United. Do you think he will be able to break into that starting 11 for next season?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, we brought him in for about £15 million, rumoured. I think Manchester United, don't typically tend to sign, poor prospects. So I think, the fact that he's been around that scene and he's, had some features for Sweden means that there's a strong opportunity. And then equally, if we were to lose Brennan Johnson for a transfer, then, he'd probably be the most natural fit. I think the thing about Forest that we kind of learned from last season is there's probably going to be a slight difference in terms of the away team structure versus home team structure. So I'd actually like us to be a bit more front-footed at home, especially maybe a sort of a more 4-2-3-1, in which you'd then see Elanga on the left wing behind a striker, whereby away games, it may well be that he's kind of featured more, last 20 minutes or so in terms of just being an outlet. I think, typically Cooper's, even in the promotion season, we were oftentimes a little cautious in those first 60 minutes away from home and then sort of relied on the, counter-attacking pace and ruthlessness of a Brennan Johnson to close out games. I wonder if Elanga is going to be used in the same way away from home. But, he's a good asset. I think he could potentially be one that is a good sleeper for this season. Many don't sort of think of because he's been sort of hidden away at Manchester United and now there's a real prospect for him to have first team activity at Forest.
Okay. And lastly, Ola Aina coming in from Torino. If I'm not mistaken, is this the Chelsea? He used to be a Chelsea player.
Yeah, former Chelsea youth. And I think there's some previous England youth system connection to, obviously, Steve Cooper was in that. So I think there's this, past history there. He's featured a little bit in some of these pre-season friendlies. And I think based upon I mentioned previously, Richards and Toffolo doubts, the fact he's a more sort of natural fullback maybe than Nico Williams, I suspect he'll start. So, free transfer in from Roma, but, could have a role. I'm a bit concerned, I guess, in terms of Forest defensive risk in those first 6 games because, although we found a formula last season, it's also not inconceivable that we could go to Arsenal and lose 5-0 like we did last season. So, signing a Forest fullback as is probably not top of my drafting strategy.
Awesome. I mean, hopefully you guys have a better start to the season than that. But yeah, let's see how things go. So I mean, those are some of the names and transfers I kind of want to touch on. Are there any other names that we've not mentioned that you'd like to talk about before we move on to the expected formation starting 11?
Yeah, so I mean, I think there's a couple of players that Forest have been linked with who would be worth just tracking over the next 3 or 4 weeks and capture maybe a free agency early on, because if we were, for example, to get, say, Roger Ibanez from Roma, he could be a pretty material signing. So could Ibrahim Sangare. That could, they both players have seemingly got offers from other clubs. So if we could land one of those, I think also Josip Tarlo, who's a Croatian centre back, has been linked as well. So there could be some big signings coming in that would kind of go beneath the radar for people in their sort of normal draft cycles. So I think from a Forest perspective, it's definitely a question of keeping an eye out and seeing what might be out there. And then similarly, as I mentioned with Brennan Johnson, it feels like the club has sort of set a price of, around 50 million. We had some interest in Brentford that got rejected. There's some rumours that if Kane goes, then Spurs might be interested. So if you were to draft Brennan Johnson, it may not necessarily be as a Forest player, and depending on where he ends up, that could give you some upside potentially.
Okay, interesting. All right, so let's say the season's starting tomorrow. What would be your expected formation and starting 11?
Yeah, I think if the season starts tomorrow, well, our first game away from home, as I say, I'd expect us to be maybe a little bit more defensive, more like a sort of 5-2-2-1. We tend to have that sort of box midfield that often drops back into a sort of 5-4-1. Gibbs White's just pivotal to that because he's such a versatile player. You know, he can play as a false 9, he can play as a regular 8, you know, typically sits as a 10 or off the left side. So when we don't have the ball, we look different to when we do. So I think that sort of 5-2-2-1 is probably what I'd expect away at Arsenal. Goalkeeper, as I mentioned, is a real unknown because we'd have to close Turner as a signing probably in the next couple of days, and I don't see the upside for Arsenal necessarily trying to sell someone to us the day before they play us. Henderson wouldn't be fit if we could close him, which then your options really are Hordath or George Shelvey. So I think goalkeeper's a bit of an avoid at this point in time. So many unknowns. Defensively, we spoke about the back five. I suspect it would be Aurier, Worrell, Bolly and McKenna based on fitness and availability, and then Aina as a left back. And then this sort of midfield four would probably be a sort of box midfield with Yates and Mangala, and then Danilo and Morgan Gibbs-White behind either Brennan Johnson, but it's probably unlikely because away from home he tend to feature less. And if a one-use fit, I think he would start. But Chris Wood might be the default for that away day, just to give us an outlet ball if a one-use's not fit, or if there's still question marks around Brennan Johnson's future. But I think really the assets of note are Danilo and obviously Gibbs-White in terms of how we can maybe get something on the counter-attack and go from there.
Okay, lovely. So quickly on AFCON and Asian Cup, are you guys going to be affected in any way?
Yeah, so that's definitely something to note. I'm not super current on all the players, whether they're still actively international, because I know sometimes players go in and out. But we do have a strong base for the AFCON. So Oleana's interested around Nigeria, Niakate and Kouyaté in Senegal, Serge Aurier for Ivory Coast, as is Willy Bolly, and then Taiwo Awoniyi and Emmanuel Dennis, both from Nigeria. So there's some real consideration there. Clearly, the impact is dependent on the depth and how far some of these countries go. If we saw, for example, a Nigeria versus Senegal final, then Forest are going to be kind of short of half a team. But who knows? So there's some considerations there for sure.
Lovely. All right, so now let's talk fan tracks. This is a segment where all the fans and listeners really care about. But I know that you're so why don't you I guess before we get into this, let the listeners know like what's your background with respect to Fantrax FPL, NFL, that sort of stuff, because typically we do chat with like a lot of experienced Fantrax managers, so we're gonna have a slightly different approach to this this episode, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely. So I've got a kind of interest off the back of playing this sort of more traditional FPL game for the last 15 years and done pretty well with that. Being that Forest weren't in the Premier League for 23 years, that's kind of where my interest stopped. And now I'm sort of like, oh, okay, so this is fun. We might be a Premier League side for a while. And I also like the opportunity to actually own a single player in isolation versus, everyone getting the same types of players and same teams. So that's what drew me to Fantrax for this season. So I'm a novice in that space, but obviously open to ideas and suggestions. I do have a previous in relation to the sort of draft format of playing NFL for multiple years as well, and obviously the trades and considerations there. And I think there's some transferability for me. A couple of my strategies I often employ when it comes to NFL is looking at those potential sort of premium backups or handcuffs, as they often call them. So, I'm thinking if you were to draft, simplistically Haaland, then your handcuff would be Alvarez if you could get him too. And I think sometimes there's some good strategy there to be played, that you have the backup of a player that's going to have a big impact, and as a result of them coming in their absence, then you've got some continuity. So I'm going to look at it a little bit that way. But I'm excited to have the opportunity to own someone in isolation and also see some of those players that I'm really interested in, seeing improve, like Danilo, for example, how they could potentially have a material impact across the leagues.
Love it. Yeah, you know what? You're using all the right terminology. I think you'll be fine. And given your fantasy knowledge as well, especially at least experience with Premier League assets, yeah, I think you'll fit right in. By any chance, are you playing in any of the community leagues, or are you already involved in a Fantrax league yet?
Not yet, so I'm absolutely open to that. So yeah, please just like DM me on Twitter, Ross Taylor 79, if there's interesting leagues to get involved in. I'd certainly want to stay connected through this group and in yourself, and open to all sorts of leagues. I certainly invest probably enough time and energy to be connected on the football ecosystem to warrant maybe a couple more leagues than I have. So I'm open to that for sure.
So, there is a chance that we might be able to help you out with that, because what I've kind of liked to do in the past few seasons is I'm eagerly trying to convert people to playing the Fantrax format. And in our Banter Boys home league, we actually have a league where there's a lot of experienced managers, but we've got, I want to call it like a relegation league in a sense. But that relegation league is really an opportunity for new managers, new players trying out Fantrax for the first time. And it's a group of very, I guess, first season sort of managers. So, I mean, if you're interested and you're keen, I can definitely hook you up in that sense, Ross.
Yes, please think of me. I'd certainly like to stay connected on that. And obviously, I'm happy to stay connected on Forest fortunes this season. And I'm okay getting relegated in Fantrax as long as Forest don't get relegated in the Premier League. I'll take that.
Excellent. All right, so let's talk about some draft picks now. If you had to suggest the first pick from Nottingham Forest, I feel like it's kind of obvious.
Yeah, I mean, it's really hard to look anywhere beyond Morgan Gibbs-White. As I mentioned, his contributions last year were considerable. He's just such a rounded footballer in terms of just his work rate, and where his route to points, I think, is just amazing. And his fitness record was really strong last season around others that weren't. So he would definitely be the default. I'm nervous a little bit that he may just be kind of boxed out a little bit from other teams just out of just second season respect. So there's a regression risk, I think, there. But generally speaking, his contribution at large should be more than enough to justify his kind of second round pick based upon the rankings that I've seen. So Gibbs-White's definitely the starting point for me.
Yeah, I mean, for Forrest, he led the team in key passes, which is chances created, accurate crosses into the box, successful dribbles. So, I mean, he has a very all-rounded attacking nature or feature to his style of play, right? And it's just good when, a player that you pick has penalties and is kind of nailed in that sense. I would expect him to be like the first name on the team sheet, which you would want, right, from your first pick in any sort of draft game in a sense.
Yeah, most definitely. And also his versatility, as I mentioned, is incredible. So if we wanted to play a 4-3-3, maybe sort of drop off on the left, or if we needed him to play a false nine, he did that as well. And if we were sort of, I mentioned, maybe a bit more defensive away from home, either a 5-4-1 or a 4-5-1, like he can slot into that kind of base midfield. So, as I say, his routes to points are so strong, and also his versatility on being on the team sheet in whatever formation is so high. So, yeah, he's a very obvious first pick from Forest's perspective.
All right. So, what about your next three picks from Forest? Let's go one at a time.
Yeah, so I kind of go a little bit with a sort of mixed emotion on the second one because, Brennan Johnson is a player that I'd love to see at Forest. He's homegrown through the club. Seems to be a really good grounded lad, and I also believe that one more strong season at Forest and he could really be a sort of £75 million player and above, and probably look at a top six departure. But if he plays for us, then great. Realistically, though, his contribution may be less than maybe if he showed up for a Spurs, for example, if he were to be linked there post Harry Kane. Obviously, this is all speculation, but so I'd draft him with that sort of mixed view that he could either be as a Forest player, or you could potentially see some upside if he showed up somewhere else before the window closed. So he would be my second one. Again, if Gibbs-White isn't playing, maybe he would be the default on penalties. He's just he's a real classy contributor in terms of assists, and he's really improved, I think, his sort of final third contribution. not so active in terms of just like being a high pressing midfielder, or attacker. But I think his finishing is really strong, and if we can create more chances to him, then his conversion rate is really strong. And I think as a result, his output from a kind of Fantrax perspective will increase. So he's the second one, and then the third one I sort of mentioned already. It's a little bit of a toss up for me between Danilo and Awoniyi. I think Awoniyi, if he were to play the whole time, and you wanted someone that's sort of mid bracket sort of striker, he could be a real solid contributor. But I'm just so excited about the prospect of Danilo at large, and where his ceiling is. That he's kind of a late round version of Gibbs White potentially that you could pick up for some really decent value. And if Forest can be a bit more free scoring, then I think Danilo could have a role in that. So a few ifs in there, obviously, because we have to be a bit more front-footed. But as I say, I really like what I see about Danilo.
Yeah, I mean, on the names that you've mentioned, like Brennan, I believe was the second highest Fantrax scorer for Nottingham Forest last season. Awoniyi scored the most goals for you guys last season as well. And I mean, even if you look at the form, pre-World Cup, post-World Cup, in terms of points output per game, Brennan didn't really have a great start to the season, but after the World Cup, he ended up averaging around 8 points per game. And Awoniyi, again, similar to that, like 7.5 points per game. So both definitely have potential to be great assets from Nottingham Forest if you're looking there to roster, let's say, both forwards as well. And yeah, Danilo could definitely be, I want to say, almost like a sleeper pick in a sense, like, because he didn't show that form until later on into the season, right?
Yes, yeah, exactly. He was a January signing and then took a little while to bed in, and then I think the assumption, as I say, was that he was going to be more of a holding midfielder, but he seems to be a bit more free attacking in the system as is right now. So yeah, he'll be a bit more of a known entity this season. But if you could draft him late, then I think you can get some real value there.
All right. What about hidden gems? What have you got up your sleeve?
Yeah, we spoke a little bit about Anthony Elanga, and I think that's maybe a watch to see in terms of game time in those early weeks. Same Nico Williams as well, someone potentially as a consideration, largely because of the versatility either at left back or right back. But with that said, I don't expect him necessarily to start against Arsenal. So again, you can probably just sleep on that. But the one that's kind of a bit of an unsung hero. And again, this is where I'm kind of learning a little bit about Fantrax's contribution. But Ryan Yates is a player that has kind of worked up the levels with Forest, and I think he's improved at every level he's been asked. And when he played for us last season, typically Forest played better. We had some major absences, and he's that kind of. I kind of joke with friends. He's a little bit like a wasp. He kind of is like everywhere, but you don't really know what he does for the ecosystem. But it's better than nothing. So he's kind of he seems to rattle other teams, and picks up some cheap free kicks and wins the ball at key moments. So I think he's one of those players that his fitness record this season should be better than last, and when he plays, he's better for us in aggregate. And I think depending on specific contribution metrics, he could be someone to look at because he pops up with the odd goal as well from set pieces.
Vital goals as well, I want to say. Yeah, definitely. Okay, so in terms of like Nico Williams, I'm quite excited about Nico because when we draft assets in the Fantrax game, like all managers should know, ghost points are very important, right? And when we talk about ghost points, just as a reminder, we're looking at the points that a Fantrax asset accumulates, sans or without goals, assists, or clean sheets, right? So we're talking about just pure productivity. And especially for defenders, every time you concede a goal, it's -2 points, right? So ideally, I think the way you kind of look at options from defense is that you assume you're not getting the clean sheet. You assume they're going to concede at least one goal, and maybe you start the scoring at like -2 in that sense, right? So if your defender can, concede a goal and still score, let's say, 7 to 9 points, I'd be quite happy with that. And one player that we kind of saw a very good ghost points per 90 from last season was Nico Williams. But my concern again is that rotation between him and Aurier.
Yeah, absolutely. That's definitely a risk. But then potential upside, as I say, is he can play a little further up the pitch
Yeah.
if needed. So you kind of might get a more attacking right back playing in a midfield position, especially if Johnson were to move on. I think he's a good ball runner as well, and isn't afraid to like put the ball into key areas. So I think that's probably why his stats are pretty strong. But just early stages, again, based upon that rotation risk, there's probably others to consider in that sort of same kind of round range at this point in time. But he's a watch and see.
Yeah, and Felipe was a very much a fan favorite from last season, but I guess because of his injury concerns and stuff like that, I guess you would probably rely on the likes of maybe Joe Worrell or Willy Boley to rack up those defensive contributions.
Yeah, I think so. I think Worrell's another one who probably had a difficult start at the beginning, and both Worrell and McKenna are not super fast, and obviously it's a fast league, so as a result, typically, when they're playing, would probably drop into a back three. I think Worrell's probably a more readily available player, maybe than Boley, although Boley might pop up with the odd set piece. But Worrell, I think, is really kind of just one of those key players, similar to Yates, within the club, that clearly is just trying to drive the standard up and elevate his own game to the level. So I think I'd probably lean more towards Worrell than Boley, from that perspective.
Okay, love it. All right. So let's move on to the final segment then, where we talk about just your experience as a draft manager in that sense, because I think it's definitely applicable or transferable. Your experience playing other American sports, that sort of stuff. So, what's your experience with trading draft picks before your season has started?
Not so much beforehand. Some of the leagues I've been in just typically drafting drafting trades beforehand is just not that common. More so just during the season. I don't know whether I'd be interested to know the stats in terms of how many people really draft. It's a key part of the game. It's probably the fun part of the game, but I also think people sometimes just are too cautious, or they have sort of buyer seller remorse on trades. So I'd love to do more trading than potentially I have done in all formats of other games. So any league that I join, I'd certainly be interested to those where there's maybe an active trade culture, because I think that's a real fun part of the game.
Okay, so if you were to trade with other managers then, what sort of metric would you use? Would you look at form? Would you look at fixtures? Maybe proven status in the league for the past few seasons?
Yeah, I think those are all good starting points. I think, looking at future outlook is obviously the main thing in terms of game time, and also the difficulty of the fixtures and how their team's set up against those potential games. And I think a lot of it's just kind of gut feel, right? In terms of, someone said to me, "Hey, you can have Jared Bowen versus Morgan Gibbs-White." I would say, no thanks, I'll keep Gibbs-White, just because there's the emotional attachment, even though Bowen could go hot at any point too. So I think a lot of it is a little bit heart over head as well. Just how much do you really want to get behind a certain player? And I don't know whether you've had this from other fans too, but in other formats of the game, the difficulty of being a Forest fan last season was just not wanting other players to do well against your team. So, 23 years outside the Premier League, like, we haven't got the 20 years of history of other big teams. So it's just, I just can't I look at my drafts now and it's like, I don't want to pick Arsenal players for the first game of the season against Forest. Like, it's just, it's not where I want to go. And I think I did the same with Newcastle last season too. So it's just, there's a difficulty there. You just have to be pragmatic about who you're selecting and trying to disconnect your own allegiances.
Yeah, it's funny. When we did the Spurs episode, our fan rep, actually, his first pick was Bukayo Saka, and he sounded so torn when he talked about it. He's like, I really don't want Arsenal to do well, but I need my first pick to, absolutely smash it. So if it's okay, if they, lose a game 5-3 and Saka gets a hat-trick, that will make my day.
Yeah, exactly. So, I mean, ultimately everyone plays everyone eventually. So at some point I have to get comfortable with it. But, if my first round pick doesn't happen to play against Forest when they come round to it, then I won't be sad.
Definitely. All right. So it's interesting. The notes that I had on buy low, sell high. You're the first fan rep that actually made me think about it in a different sense, and I've never looked at it this way. But I'm gonna, it's first time for everything. If there were assets from Nottingham Forest that you could, apply this sort of logic where you could sell high or buy low sort of stuff, what are the assets that you're looking at?
Yeah, so for me, I think there's a degree of risk because you're taking out that predictability of minutes, but the potential upside. So I would point more towards probably Danilo's first up. I mentioned him at length, but also Elanga, because Elanga's coming in with, certainly at home, like the high opportunity of having a starting place on that left wing. And if he does well and really starts contributing, then certainly it sort of raises the question of how he could fit in. And I think he's just one of those types of players that people are just going to pass over, just because, unknown or kind of been hidden in the depths of United's squad. And, he could get a lot of minutes and just be a kind of surprise package. So I think in that instance, I would be looking at kind of drafting them in late or in free agency, and then being comfortable with what trade value I could get out of that, trying to detach the emotion of it and just say, okay, I got Elanga on the cheap and I managed to get a 6th, 7th round pick in trade out of it. So I like to go kind of to the low end of players that are fringe who have that high ceiling and then kind of trade out as quickly as I can to sort of cash that value. So that's the kind of NFL mentality that I would take into the Fantrax game for FPL.
Okay, love it. So you probably don't have a history of best or worst trades, given this is going to be your first year in the Fantrax community, and as well as with Fab budgeting. So if you're not aware, I guess a quick summary of that is, so you know how you typically have free agency and waiver wires and that sort of stuff? This is basically another layer of the game where you're given a budget to start the season, let's say $100 fantasy dollars, and you're allowed to spend it in increments of at least $1. You're now also allowed to obviously bid nothing and just try and claim them for free or whatever. But this is just an extra added layer of complexity that I think adds a nice dynamic to the game, because it's not just okay, we're gonna do it based on priority order or something like that. So you could be lost on the priority order but still spend more money than the other manager. The priority order only comes in as the tiebreaker if you spend the same amount of money on an asset. So I would say my experience of playing the game, and I guess this is a reminder to Fantrax managers, maybe they have different strategies, everyone does, is not to blow all of your budget on one new shiny toy that, let's say, comes in at the end of the summer window or even in the January window, because sometimes new assets struggle to fit in, and I feel like sometimes the best picks are the ones that you maybe drop that cheeky $1 or $2 bid on, because there's no influx of cash into the league. Whatever's spent is gone into thin air. You can't get that back, right? Unless you maybe trade with another manager where you give them a player and you get a lesser valued player plus some of their Fab budget money. So that's the way kind of Fab works, and you're definitely gonna get a lot of experience with it for the upcoming season, and trust me, you're gonna learn a lot.
Yeah, and I'm excited about that. Actually, that's probably the most appealing part of the game that makes it kind of different from other formats, that you can kind of bring that element of sort of value based kind of recruitment into it as well. I need to make sure that I'm getting comfortable with the formats. I guess that's another kind of watch item and tip for others listening is I do have a history of accidentally dropping like a 2nd round pick, thinking I was dropping them to the bench, not dropping them to waiver wire. And I had to contact the commissioner and be like, hey, I didn't mean to do this. And, so just familiarize yourself with the interfaces, I think is job one for me. But yeah, the Fab piece is intriguing, and especially if you see, I heard you talking previously about the potential Mbappe arrival in the Premier League, how that could just change the whole Fab thing and how silly money could get thrown at it. So it's a really intriguing element. I'm excited by it.
Definitely. All right. So in terms of maybe lessons learned, because this season will be your first season, are there any sort of, I guess, is there advice that you can maybe share to both new managers and like yourself, or even old managers, lessons learned from playing fantasy football, be it FPL or even in the NFL, that you think could be applicable for your first ever season in Fantrax?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of things. I think maybe some of your previous interviews you've spoken about it too. Just not taking it too seriously. I know I can very quickly get into my head, especially if it's a week where not only Forest lose, but then also my point score is poor, how it can affect my weekend. And so I need to make sure I'm sort of staying straight on that for the household. Also not being too distracted by it in terms of just an engagement activity at large. A couple of times my wife will pop over my shoulder and be like, "Oh, you're playing with your silly little men again," asking a question about that. And I'm like, yeah, and there's only so many times in a week you really need to look at these things. So some discipline around that I think is important. But I also think the bit that, I'm trying to get some late round value. I think that's my strategy at large. And that could include like a handcuff type acquisition, depending on who my sort of early round sort of signings might be. It's probably less of a strategy for FPL than it would be in NFL, whereby, getting a backup running back for a team is probably a logical thing to do. Whereby, if you get a backup for Saka, it's not, Trossard's not a like for like backup for Saka, so to speak. So it's not quite the same, but, maybe you could do it with a, Wan-Bissaka and the other right back at Man City, I'm blanking on. Man United. You might just get
Diago Dalot.
So you get that extra protection if you really want to have that team. So I'm going to look at it in that way, and then also I'm going to sort of just pick some holes in terms of points gains and route to points, and see if those players like Ryan Yates, who contribute heavily for the team, are really rewarded in the construct of the game. Because I really hope they are, and because oftentimes, one of the shortcomings I think with FPL is just the bias towards that first goal and getting those early points, and really being about goals and assists versus the build-up play or the pre-assist or winning the ball back. And I think Fantrax has got a way better path to points, and I'm really excited by that.
Awesome. All right, listeners. So those are the picks. That is the pod. That's all we had planned. Ross, thank you so much for taking time out of your schedule. I'm so excited that in a sense, popping your Fantrax cherry. I can't wait to see your growth and development as a Fantrax manager. I would say, and this is not just for you, but a reiteration for anyone that's coming across this podcast or this game for the first time, is that the Fantrax community on Twitter is a great place to get started. If you have questions, if you want advice, there are so many friendly faces that are willing to engage with you and help you out. Also, if you're on Discord, is another place to come start a conversation, ask questions, get information. There's the fantastic the Draft Society that has their draft kit. It's basically the perfect place to start if you're playing Fantrax for the first time. I know there's also a lot of other resources like the guys at Overthinking Football, PL on Tap. So shout out to all the content creators in our space. Honestly, you guys are doing a fantastic job. The season's just around the corner as well, so things are definitely ramping up. So what we'll do is we will definitely keep an eye on Ross. We will incubate him, as I want to say, and I can't wait to bring him back on later on in the season and update you guys on his experience. I don't know if it's going to be joy or frustration. We'll see how his draft goes and how his season goes. But yeah, quite excited to witness his journey in the Fantrax game. And yeah, listeners, thanks again for tuning in for another episode. Stay tuned. We've got another Fantrax rep coming on. I'm going to keep it as a surprise, but just stay tuned and we'll catch you on the next episode. Peace.